In a small, quiet town nestled in the heart of the Midwest, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The streets were lined with modest houses, their yards dotted with colorful flowers and neatly trimmed hedges. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, and children played freely under the watchful eyes of neighbors. Among these children was Lily Harper, an 8-year-old girl with bright blue eyes and a mop of curly blonde hair that seemed to bounce with every step she took. Lily was known for her boundless curiosity and fearless spirit. While other kids her age preferred to stay close to home or play within the confines of their backyards, Lily often wandered further, exploring every nook and cranny of the surrounding area. Her favorite spot was a patch of woods that bordered her family's property. The woods were thick with towering oak trees and carpeted with soft moss, creating a magical atmosphere that fueled her imagination. She would spend hours there, pretending to be an explorer, discovering hidden treasures, or a brave adventurer facing untold dangers. On this particular evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, and pink, Lily decided to visit her beloved woods one last time before dinner. Her mother had called her inside earlier, reminding her not to stray too far. But Lily couldn't resist the pull of the forest. With a quick glance over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching, she slipped through the gap in the fence and disappeared into the trees. The air in the woods was cool and carried the faint scent of pine. Birds chirped lazily in the branches above, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at squirrels darting between the trunks. Lily skipped along a narrow path, humming a tune she had made up on the spot. She stopped briefly to inspect a cluster of mushrooms growing near the base of a tree, poking at them with a stick to see if they would move. Satisfied that they were ordinary, she continued on her way, her mind filled with thoughts of imaginary quests and secret worlds. Suddenly, a strange sound interrupted the peaceful ambience of the woods. It started as a low hum, barely audible, over the natural symphony around her, but quickly grew louder. Lily paused, tilting her head as she tried to identify the source. The noise was unlike anything she had ever heard before, neither bird nor insect, nor any machine she could think. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, vibrating through the ground beneath her feet and sending a shiver up her spine, before she could decide whether to investigate or run back home. The sky above the treetops lit up with a brilliant flash of light. It was so bright that it momentarily blinded her, forcing her to shield her eyes with her hands. When she lowered them, she saw something streaking across the heavens like a falling star. But instead of fading away, the object grew larger and brighter, heading straight toward the woods. A deafening roar accompanied its descent. Shaking the earth violently and knocking Lily off balance, she scrambled to her feet, heart pounding in her chest, and looked around wildly. The object crashed somewhere nearby, sending a shockwave rippling through the air. Leaves and twigs rained down from the trees, and a cloud of dust rose into the sky. For a moment, everything went eerily silent. Then, slowly, the sounds of the forest returned. The birds resumed their chirping, and the wind whispered through the branches. But something felt different now, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Curiosity outweighed fear, and Lily cautiously approached the direction of the crash. She pushed aside bushes and stepped over fallen logs, her sneakers crunching softly against the forest floor. As she drew closer, she noticed a faint glow emanating from a clearing ahead. Peering through the foliage, she froze in awe at what she saw. In the center of the clearing floated a group of creatures unlike anything she could have imagined. They were long and sinuous, resembling giant snakes, but covered in shimmering scales that reflected the dim light, like liquid metal. Their bodies hovered several feet above the ground, twisting and coiling gracefully as if swimming through invisible water. Each creature had multiple sets of luminous eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intensity. Scanning their surroundings with unnerving precision, Lily pressed herself against a tree trunk. Trying to stay hidden while she observed them, she counted 5 of the creatures, each one slightly different in size and coloration, Some had deep green scales flecked with gold, while others shimmered in hues of silver and blue. Despite their alien appearance, there was an undeniable beauty to them, almost hypnotic in nature. Yet beneath that allure lay an unmistakable sense of danger. One of the creatures suddenly turned, its gaze directly toward her hiding spot, Lily's. Breath caught in her throat as those glowing eyes locked onto hers. She wanted to run, to scream for help, but her body refused to obey. Instead, she stood frozen, clutching the rough bark of the tree as if it might anchor her to reality. Without warning, the creature lunged forward with astonishing speed. Its tail whipped out, wrapping tightly around Lily's waist before she could react. She let out a startled cry as she was lifted off the ground, dangling helplessly in midair. The world spun around her as the creature brought her closer to its face, examining her with those piercing eyes. Up close, she could see intricate patterns etched into its scales, glowing faintly as though alive with energy. The other creatures gathered around, their movements fluid and deliberate. They didn't attack or harm her. Instead, they seemed to be studying her, communicating silently among themselves in ways she couldn't understand. Lily clung to the hope that maybe they weren't hostile, that perhaps they were just as curious about her as she was about them. But deep down, fear gnawed at her, whispering doubts and worst-case scenarios as the minutes dragged on. Lily realized she was being carried deeper into the woods, away from the crash site and any chance of rescue. The creatures moved swiftly, weaving between the trees with ease. She tried calling out for help, but her voice came out weak and hoarse, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she thought of her parents, wondering if they even knew she was missing yet. Eventually, the group emerged into another clearing, this one larger and more open than the first. At its center loomed a massive, jagged structure that seemed to pulse with the same ethereal glow as the creature's scales. It wasn't made of stone or metal, but appeared to be crafted from some sort of crystalline material, translucent and shimmering with internal light. Strange symbols danced across its surface, shifting and rearranging themselves like living hieroglyphs. The creature holding Lily deposited her gently on the ground near the structure, keeping a watchful eye on her as it joined the others. She sat there, trembling and wide-eyed, unsure of what would happen next. The creatures formed a loose circle around her, their tails swaying rhythmically as if conducting some unseen orchestra. The air grew heavy with anticipation, charged with an energy that prickled against her skin, though terrified. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that these beings weren't entirely malevolent. There was intelligence behind their actions, a purpose driving their behavior. She wondered if they'd come here accidentally, lost or stranded far from whatever place they called home. Or perhaps they sought something specific, something only Earth could provide. Whatever the reason, Lily knew one thing for certain. Her life had changed forever in the span of a single night, and as the creatures began to emit low, melodic hums that resonated through the clearing, Lily braced herself for whatever fate awaited her. Lily's disappearance sent shockwaves through the small town. Her parents, Mary and Robert Harper, were frantic. They had called her name repeatedly, searched every room in their house, and even checked with neighbors to see if anyone had spotted her. But as the hours ticked by without a trace, panic began to take hold. The peaceful evening turned into a nightmare, and soon, the entire community was mobilized in search of the missing girl. Word spread quickly, and by nightfall, groups of volunteers armed with flashlights and lanterns scoured the woods and surrounding areas. Dogs barked as they sniffed for clues, their handlers calling out Lily's name into the darkness. Despite the collective effort, no one found any sign of her. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. Amidst the chaos, two strangers arrived. In town, they drove an old, unmarked van that looked like it had seen better days. Jack Monroe stepped out first, his tall frame casting a long shadow under the flickering streetlight. He wore a worn leather jacket over a plain black shirt, and his boots were caked with mud, suggesting he'd traveled far. His face was rugged, with sharp cheekbones and a stubbled jawline that gave him a weathered appearance. Beside him stood Grace Ellis, her shorter stature contrasting sharply with Jack's imposing figure. She had soft features framed by shoulder-length brown hair, and her calm demeanor seemed almost out of place in the midst of such urgency. The pair introduced themselves as wildlife researchers, claiming they were in the area studying bird migration patterns when they heard about Lily's disappearance. Their explanation raised eyebrows among some of the locals, but no one questioned them too closely, not with a child missing. Jack carried a heavy backpack slung over one shoulder, while Grace held a clipboard and a small handheld device that emitted faint beeping sounds. When they approached the Harpers' home, Mary greeted them with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. "Please," she pleaded, "if you can help us find my daughter." Her voice trailed off, choked with emotion. Robert stood behind her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression a mixture of grief and barely contained rage. Jack nodded solemnly. "We'll do everything we can," he said, his deep voice carrying a reassuring tone. Grace added softly, "Sometimes animals leave traces we might not notice right away. Let's start where she was last seen." They followed the Harpers to the edge of the property, where the gap in the fence marked Lily's entry point into the woods. As they examined the area, Grace knelt down, running her fingers over the disturbed soil near the opening. Jack walked a few paces ahead, scanning the ground with a focused intensity. His eyes narrowed when he spotted something unusual, a series of claw-like marks gouged deeply into the bark of a nearby tree. "These don't look natural," he muttered, brushing his fingertips against the grooves. The marks were wide and jagged, unlike anything left by local wildlife. He glanced at Grace, who nodded silently. Both of them exchanged a knowing look, their expressions darkening slightly. "What is it?" Robert asked, stepping closer. "Do you think an animal took her?" Grace hesitated before answering. "It's possible," she said carefully. "But these marks, Caracist, they're not consistent with bears or wolves. We need to investigate further." She adjusted the strap of her clipboard and pulled out a small scanner from her bag, aiming it toward the trees. The device emitted a higher-pitched beep as she moved it around, signaling anomalies in the environment. Jack turned to the Harpers. "Can you tell us more about what happened? Did anyone hear anything unusual earlier today?" Mary shook her head. "No, nothing. Just that light in the sky. Everyone saw it. People are saying it was a meteor or something, but I don't know." "A meteor?" Grace repeated, exchanging another glance with Jack. This time, there was a flicker of concern in her eyes as the group continued discussing the details. A young boy named Ethan approached hesitantly. He was one of Lily's classmates, clutching a stuffed toy in his hands. I saw something," he stammered, drawing everyone's attention. "Before the light came, I was playing outside, and I heard this weird buzzing sound like bees, but louder. And then the ground shook." Jack crouched down to meet Ethan's gaze. "Good job telling us, buddy. Can you show me where you were when you heard it?" Ethan nodded and led them to a spot deeper in the woods, close to where Lily had been taken. The ground here was littered with broken branches and flattened grass, evidence of some kind of impact. Grace scanned the area again, her device beeping erratically. She frowned, jotting notes on her clipboard. "There's residual energy here," she murmured. "Not electrical, but something else." Robert grew impatient. "What does that mean?" "Is my daughter okay?" Grace placed a comforting hand on his arm. "We don't know yet, but we're going to find out. Whatever caused this disturbance isn't ordinary. That much is clear." Back at the crash site, Jack examined the claw marks on the tree more closely. He traced their pattern, with his finger noting how they spiraled upward rather than digging straight into the wood. "These weren't made by legs," he said quietly. "More like tails. Long, flexible ones." Grace joined him, holding up her scanner. "Oh." And the energy readings matched the ones we picked up near the clearing. "Whoever or whatever did, this left a trail." "We should follow it," Jack suggested, already moving forward. "If they've got Lily, we need to act fast." Grace hesitated. "Are you sure about this? If it's what I think it is, we could be walking into something dangerous." "I'm sure," Jack replied firmly. "We didn't come all this way to turn back now." The Harpers' reluctant blessing, Jack and Grace set off into the woods. following the faint trail of energy signatures left behind by the mysterious creatures. The forest grew darker and denser as they ventured farther. From the town, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Every step felt heavier, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them at one point. Grace stopped abruptly, pointing her scanner toward a patch of moss-covered rocks. "Look," she whispered. "Footprints. Or maybe impressions from something." Larger, Jack squatted beside her, examining the depressions in the ground. They were shallow but unmistakably shaped like elongated ovals, tapering at both ends. "Definitely not human," he concluded. "And definitely not native to Earth." Grace swallowed hard. "Do you think they're still here?" "I don't know," Jack admitted. "But if they are, we'll have to tread carefully. These things may not be hostile, but they're clearly advanced. One wrong move, and we could make things worse." They pressed on, navigating the uneven terrain with growing unease. The air felt colder now, tinged with an odd metallic scent that neither of them could explain. The forest seemed quieter too, as if the usual nocturnal sounds had been silenced by an unseen presence. Eventually they reached a clearing similar to the one described by the townsfolk. In the center stood a cluster of strange, crystalline formations jutting out of the ground like jagged teeth. The structures glimmered faintly, their surfaces etched with intricate patterns that shifted and shimmered under the light of their flashlights. Grace approached cautiously, her scanner going haywire as she drew nearer. "This is it," she breathed. "Whatever crashed here, left behind technology or biology, I can't tell which. It's unlike anything I've ever encountered." Jack circled the area, his eyes scanning for signs of movement. "No bodies," he noted grimly. "They're hiding, or they've already moved on." Grace nodded, her mind racing. "If they've taken Lily somewhere else, we need to figure out where." As they debated their next move, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet.
Oh.
Jack instinctively grabbed Grace's arm, pulling her back toward the trees. "We need to get out of here," he urged. "Now." But before they could retreat, a shadow moved across the clearing. Something large and sinuous emerged from the darkness, its form illuminated briefly by the glowing crystals. It wasn't alone. Several others appeared, encircling the humans with deliberate, hypnotic movements. Their scales shimmered like liquid starlight, and their multiple sets of eyes locked onto Jack and Grace with unnerving focus. For a moment, neither of them dared to move. Then slowly, Jack raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "We're not here to hurt you," he said, his voice steady, despite the tension in the air. "We're looking for a little girl. She's important to us." The creatures didn't respond, at least, not in a way that either of them could understand. Instead, they tilted their heads, studying the intruders with an intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. Grace tightened her grip on her scanner, hoping its readings might offer some clue about their intentions. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the creatures retreated, disappearing into the shadows. As silently as they had come, the hum faded, the crystals dimmed until the clearing was once again cloaked in darkness. Jack exhaled sharply, lowering his hands. "Well," he said, his voice tinged with both relief and frustration, "that answers one question." "That?" Grace asked, still shaken. "They're watching us," Jack replied, "and they're letting us know it." Jack and Grace stood frozen in the clearing, their flashlights casting shaky beams of light across the now empty space. The creatures had vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only the faint hum of residual energy pulsing through the air. Despite the eerie calm, both of them felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Grace tightened her grip on her scanner, glancing at its screen. The device was still beeping erratically, though the readings were weaker. Now, as if the creature's departure had drained some of the ambient energy. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "But they left something behind." Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. He scanned the perimeter of the clearing, his sharp eyes catching every detail. The crystalline structures that had glowed so brightly moments ago were now dull, their intricate patterns fading into obscurity. Yet scattered around the base of the formations were faint traces of what looked like molten residue smooth. Glassy patches embedded. In the dirt, Jack knelt to examine one of them, running his fingers lightly over its surface. It was warm to the touch, radiating a subtle heat that prickled his skin. "This isn't natural," he muttered, standing back up, whatever these things are. "They've got tech or biology that's way beyond anything we've seen before. If they took Lily, we need to figure out where they went." Grace nodded, adjusting the strap of her bag. "The energy trail is still active, but it's faint. If we want to follow it, we'll have to move fast. Once it fades completely, we might lose our chance." Without another word, the two set off deeper into the woods, guided by the intermittent beeps of Grace's scanner. The forest grew denser as they advanced, the towering trees forming a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. Shadows danced around them, twisting and shifting with every step. The silence was oppressive, broken, only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig as they walked. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, his hand instinctively brushing against the pocket knife tucked into his belt. "Do you feel that?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough not to carry too far. Grace paused, tilting her head slightly as if listening for something. Then she nodded. "Yeah, they're watching us. I don't think they're hostile, not yet anyway, but they're definitely keeping tabs on us." "Great," Jack muttered under his breath. "Just what we needed." Despite the tension, they pressed on, determined to find answers. After nearly an hour of navigating the uneven terrain, the scanner's beeping grew louder and more consistent. Grace stopped abruptly, pointing ahead. "There," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. "The signal's strongest there." Through the dense foliage, they could see the outline of another clearing. This one was larger than the previous one, with a wide expanse of open ground surrounded by thick clusters of trees. At its center stood a massive structure unlike anything they'd encountered before. It resembled a dome, but instead of solid walls, it shimmered like a mirage, its surface rippling and distorting the light that touched it. Faint symbols pulsed across its exterior, glowing softly in hues of blue and green dot. Jack let out a low whistle. "That's not from around here." "No kidding," Grace replied, her eyes wide with wonder. "It looks like some kind of barrier. Or shield. Maybe a protective field. Or a trap," Jack added grimly. "We can't just walk in blind. Need to know what we're dealing with first." Grace nodded in agreement, pulling out her notebook and jotting down observations. She pointed her scanner at the structure, analyzing its energy signature. "It's similar to what we detected earlier, but stronger. Whatever this thing is, it's powered by the same source as those creatures." Jack crossed his arms, studying the dome thoughtfully. "If Lily's inside, we need to get past it." "Any ideas?" Grace hesitated, biting her lip. "I might be able to disrupt it temporarily. My scanner has a built-in EMP function. It's designed to neutralize electronic signals. If this thing operates on any kind of electromagnetic principle, we might be able to create a gap long enough to slip through." "That's a big if," Jack said, raising an eyebrow. "And if it doesn't work, then we'll have tipped off whatever's inside," Grace admitted. "But sitting out here won't help either. We don't have much choice." Jack sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Right. Let's do it. But stay close eye. Don't want you getting caught in whatever comes next." Grace adjusted the settings on her scanner, aiming it carefully at the shimmering dome. She took a deep breath, then pressed the activation button. A high-pitched whine filled the air as the device emitted a concentrated burst of electromagnetic energy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden crackle, the surface of the dome flickered and dimmed, creating a narrow opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. "Go," Grace urged, motioning toward the gap. "I'll keep it stable as long as I can." Jack didn't hesitate. He darted forward, slipping through the opening with practiced ease. Grace followed closely behind, her heart pounding as the dome's energy surged back to life, sealing the breach behind them. They found themselves standing in a surreal landscape that seemed almost otherworldly. The ground beneath their feet was smooth and metallic, glowing faintly with the same ethereal light as the dome itself. Strange plants, tall, spindly stalks with translucent leaves, grew in clusters, swaying gently despite the absence of wind. In the distance, they could see movement. The alien dragons, the sinuous, serpentine creatures they'd encountered earlier, glided gracefully through the air, their scales reflecting the ambient glow. Some of them hovered near a cluster of smaller crystalline structures, while others circled what appeared to be a damaged ship resting on the far side of the clearing. "There," Grace whispered, pointing toward the ship. Near its base, they spotted Lily. She sat cross-legged on the ground, her blonde curls framing her face as she stared intently at one of the creatures. To their surprise, the dragon wasn't threatening her. Instead, it seemed to be communicating with her, its body language calm and deliberate. Jack frowned, lowering his voice. "What's going on? Why aren't they hurting her?" Grace shook her head, equally puzzled. Maybe they're trying to understand us, or maybe she's special somehow. Before they could decide how to approach, one of the creatures turned, its gaze toward them. Its luminous eyes locked onto Jack and Grace, and it let out a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the air. The sound was neither aggressive nor welcoming, it was a warning. "We've been spotted," Jack muttered, stepping protectively in front of Grace. "Stay behind me." The creature began to glide toward them, its movements fluid and deliberate. As it drew closer, they noticed intricate markings etched into its scales, glowing faintly in sync with the symbols on the dome. It stopped a few feet away, tilting its head as if studying them. Then, without warning, it emitted a series of melodic tones, each note layered with complex harmonics. Grace blinked in surprise. "Is it talking?" "Looks like it," Jack replied, his voice tense. "Problem is, I don't speak dragon." Grace stepped forward cautiously, holding up her hands in a gesture of peace. "We're not here to fight," she said slowly, enunciating each word. "We came to find the girl. She belongs with us." The creature tilted its head again, its multiple sets of eyes narrowing slightly. Then, to their astonishment, it responded not with words, but with images and sensations projected directly into their minds. Jack staggered backward, clutching his temples as flashes of unfamiliar landscapes, starscapes, and fragmented memories flooded his consciousness. Grace gasped, steadying herself against him as she experienced the same phenomenon. "It's showing us." Grace trailed off, struggling to process the torrent of information. Their homeworld. It's dying. They came here looking for refuge. Jack straightened, his expression hardening. "So they're refugees? That doesn't explain why they took Lily." Another wave of mental imagery hit them, this time focused on Lily herself. They saw glimpses of her wandering through the woods, her curiosity drawing her closer to the crash site. The creatures hadn't intended to harm her. They had simply reacted defensively when she entered their territory. Now, however, they viewed her as a bridge between their species and humanity, a potential ally in their quest for survival. Grace exchanged a glance with Jack, her mind racing. "They're scared," she said softly. "They don't trust us, but they need our help." "And if we refuse?" Jack asked, his tone wary. Grace hesitated, her gaze drifting toward Lily. The little girl was still seated near the ship, seemingly unharmed. She looked up, meeting Grace's eyes, and gave a small, hopeful smile. In that moment, Grace knew they couldn't turn away. "We helped them," she said firmly, "for Lily's sake and ours." Lily sat cross-legged on the smooth, glowing ground, her small hands resting on her knees. The alien dragon loomed above her, its shimmering scales casting soft reflections across her face. Its multiple sets of eyes glowed faintly, studying her, with an intensity that might have frightened anyone else. But Lily wasn't afraid anymore. She had spent hours in this strange place, surrounded by creatures that seemed more curious than threatening. Slowly, she was beginning to understand them more, at least sense their intentions. The largest dragon, which Lily had come to think of as the leader, hovered closer to her. It lowered its head until it was level with hers, its long, sinuous body coiling gently around her like a protective barrier. Then, without warning, it projected a flood of images and emotions directly into her mind. At first, the sensations were overwhelming bright flashes of stars, vast oceans of deep blue, and landscapes filled with towering crystal spires. But as the initial shock faded, Lily began to piece together what the dragon was trying to communicate. "They're showing me their home," she whispered aloud, though no one else could hear her. The dragon's thoughts painted a picture of a beautiful but dying world. Once lush and vibrant, it was now barren and crumbling, ravaged by some unseen catastrophe. The creatures had fled in search of safety, traveling across the stars in hopes of finding a new place to live. But their journey had been fraught with danger, and their ship, the damaged vessel resting nearby, was barely holding together. Lily felt a pang of sadness as the dragon shared memories of loss and struggle. Families torn apart, loved ones left behind. It was all too much for her young heart to bear. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she reached out instinctively, placing her hand against the dragon's cool metallic skin. To her surprise, the creature responded by nudging her gently with its snout, as if offering comfort. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I'm here. I'll help you." The dragon let out a low hum, the sound resonating through the air like a melody. For the first time since arriving in this strange place, Lily felt a spark of hope. Maybe she wasn't just a prisoner or an accidental intruder. Maybe she could do something to help these creatures who seemed so lost and desperate. As Jack and Grace cautiously approached, they noticed the bond forming between Lily and the dragons. The larger creature, the one communicating with her, moved aside slightly, allowing them a clearer view of the girl. Lily looked up, her tear-streaked face breaking into a tentative smile when she saw her rescuers. "Jack, Grace." She called out, scrambling to her feet. "You came." Grace rushed forward, kneeling down to embrace the child. "Are you hurt? Did they do anything to you?" Lily shook her head vigorously. "No, they didn't hurt me. They're nice, well, mostly." She glanced at the smaller dragons hovering nearby, some of which still regarded the humans with suspicion. One of them, a sleek silver creature with sharp-edged scales, growled softly, its tail flicking irritably. "That one doesn't like us," Lily explained, pointing at the aggressive dragon. "But the big one, his name is Zixer. He says they need our help." "Zixer," Jack repeated, raising an eyebrow. He turned his attention to the larger dragon, which had moved closer to observe the interaction. "So, he talks to you?" "With words," Lily replied. "He shows me pictures in my head. It's kind of like dreaming, but while I'm awake." Grace exchanged a glance with Jack, both of them processing this revelation. "She's telepathically linked to them," Grace whispered. "That's incredible and dangerous. If they can project thoughts into her mind, they could influence her." "But they haven't," Jack countered, watching as Lily returned to Zixer's side, patting its snout affectionately. "Look at her. She trusts them." Grace hesitated, torn between caution and curiosity. "We still don't know enough about them. What if they're using her, manipulating her somehow?" Before Jack could respond, Zixer emitted another series of melodic tones, drawing their attention. This time, the mental images weren't directed solely at Lily. They reached out to Jack and Grace as well. Both of them staggered slightly, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of information. They saw glimpses of advanced technology, intricate machines humming with energy, and the skeletal remains of cities reduced to rubble. Most striking of all was the image of a massive explosion, a cataclysmic event that had shattered the dragons' homeworld and forced them to flee. When the vision subsided, Grace took a shaky breath. "They're refugees," she said softly. "Their planet was destroyed. They're looking for somewhere safe to rebuild. They think Earth is the answer." Jack asked skeptically. What happens when others find out about them?
Governments
Will swoop in, scientists will dissect them, and people will panic. They won't get the refuge they're hoping for. Lily tugged at Grace's sleeve, her expression earnest. But we can help them. Zixer says their ship is broken, and they can't leave unless we fix it. Once it's repaired, they'll go away and never bother us again. Grace knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. It's not that simple, sweetheart. Fixing their ship means working with technology we don't fully understand. And even if we succeed, there's no guarantee they'll keep their promise. They will, Lily insisted. Zixer promised. He said they only want to survive. Jack sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. If we don't help them, they might decide we're a threat. And considering how advanced they are, that's a risk we can't afford to take. Grace nodded reluctantly. All right, we'll try to repair their ship, but we do it on our terms. No surprises, no tricks. Agreed, Lee beamed, nodding enthusiastically. Thank you. You won't regret it. With that settled, Zixer led them toward the damaged vessel. Up close, the ship was even more impressive and daunting. Its surface was covered in crystalline panels that shimmered like liquid glass, though many of them were cracked or darkened. Strange symbols pulsed faintly along its hull, shifting and rearranging themselves as if alive. Gaping hole near the base revealed tangled wires and exposed circuitry, glowing faintly with residual energy. Grace examined the damage carefully, jotting notes on her clipboard. This is going to take time, she muttered. Tools we don't have. We'll improvise, Jack replied, already mentally cataloging the supplies they'd need. Let's start by assessing the power source. If we can stabilize that, we might be able to reactivate some of the systems. As they worked, Zixer remained nearby, observing their efforts with keen interest. Occasionally, it would nudge one of the smaller dragons forward, encouraging it to assist. One of the creatures used its tail to delicately manipulate a piece of machinery, while another hovered above, illuminating the area with its glowing scales. Despite the language barrier, a sense of collaboration began to emerge. Grace communicated her needs through gestures and drawings, while the dragons responded with intuitive understanding. Von Jack, initially skeptical of the creatures, found himself impressed by their intelligence and cooperation. By the time the sun began to rise, outside the dome, casting a pale light through the shimmering barrier, significant progress had been made. Several of the ship's systems flickered back to life, emitting low hums and bursts of light. Grace wiped sweat from her brow, leaning back on her heels. We're getting there, she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Need reinforcement sand? Probably a miracle to finish this? Jack nodded, scanning the horizon beyond the dome. We'll figure it out. One step at a time. Lily watched them work, her admiration for both the humans and the dragons growing with each passing moment. For the first time in hours, she felt a sense of purpose or belief that together, they could overcome even the greatest challenges. The morning light filtered faintly through the shimmering dome, casting an ethereal glow over the strange landscape within. Jack and Grace had worked tirelessly alongside the alien dragons, piecing together fragments of technology that defied human understanding. The ship's systems were beginning to stabilize, but the task ahead was far from complete. Every step forward revealed new challenges, delicate components that resisted repair, energy fluctuations that threatened to undo their progress, and the ever-present tension between humans and the creatures who viewed them with cautious curiosity. Lily remained at the center of it all, her presence acting as a bridge between two vastly different worlds. She sat on the smooth, metallic ground near Zixer, watching intently as the larger dragon communicated silently with its companions. Occasionally, she would relay simple messages to Jack and Grace, translating the images and emotions projected into her mind. Though her descriptions were childlike and fragmented, they provided crucial insights into the dragon's needs and intentions. They want us to fix the engine next, Lily said, pointing toward the rear section of the ship. It's really important. Grace nodded, consulting her notes. That makes sense. If we can get the propulsion system online, they'll have a better chance of leaving safely. She glanced at Jack, who was examining a panel of crystalline circuits. But we're going to need more tools maybe some help. Jack straightened. wiping grease-streaked hands on his jeans. Help isn't exactly easy to come by out here. Bringing in outsiders could blow this whole thing wide open. I know, Grace admitted, frowning. But if we don't finish this soon, someone's bound to notice what's going on. People are already searching for Lily. We can't keep stalling. Before they could debate further, a low rumble echoed through the dome, vibrating beneath their feet. The dragons froze, their glowing eyes turning sharply toward the barrier. Zixer let out a series of urgent tones, its body coiling defensively as it positioned itself between the humans and the edge of the clearing. What's happening? Lily asked, gripping Grace's arm. I'm not sure, Grace replied, her voice tight with concern. She grabbed her scanner, aiming it toward the barrier. The device beeped erratically, its readings spiking wildly. Something's coming. Jack moved closer to the perimeter, his hand instinctively reaching for the pocket knife at his belt. Beyond the shimmering wall, the forest stirred uneasily. Shadows shifted among the trees, darker and more deliberate than before. Then, without warning, the air crackled with energy and the barrier flickered violently. A jagged rift opened briefly, revealing figures stepping through. They weren't human. The newcomers resembled the dragons inside the dome. But there was something distinctly different about them. Their scales were duller, marked with jagged scars and burn marks, as though they had endured countless battles. Their movements were aggressive and jerky, lacking the fluid grace of Zixer and his companions. One of them, a hulking creature, with serrated ridges running along its spine, emitted a guttural growl, its multiple sets of eyes gleaming with malice. Who are they? Grace whispered, backing away slowly. Zixer responded with a deep, resonant hum, its tone laced with urgency. Lily turned to Grace, her face pale. They're bad, she said quietly. Zixar says they're enemies. They want to take the ship. They'll kill anyone who gets in their way, Jack added grimly, his grip tightening on his knife. He glanced at Grace. We need to close that gap before more of them get through. Grace nodded, pulling out her scanner. I'll try to reactivate the barrier, but I'll need time. Then buy me some, Jack shot back, stepping forward to confront the intruders. The hostile dragons snarled, their tails lashing like whips as they advanced. Zixer moved swiftly to intercept them, its massive form blocking their path. The two groups clashed in a flurry of motion, scales scraping against scales as they grappled for dominance. Sparks flew where their bodies collided, and the air reverberated. With deafening roars, Grace frantically adjusted the settings on her scanner, aiming it at the barrier.
Oh.
Her fingers trembled as she pressed the activation button, triggering a burst of electromagnetic energy. The barrier flickered again, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Slowly, the rift began to seal, cutting off several of the hostile dragons still attempting to force their way inside. One of them, a smaller, but particularly vicious creature, managed to slip through just before the gap closed completely. Lunged toward Lily, its claws extended menacingly. Jack reacted instantly, throwing himself between the girl and the attacker. With a swift motion, he slashed his pocket knife across the dragon's tail, causing it to recoil with a screech of pain. Stay back, Jack shouted, brandishing the blade. The dragon hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as it assessed the threat. Behind him, Grace hurried to pull Lily out of harm's way. Jack, look out, Grace yelled, pointing toward another hostile dragon that had broken free from the skirmish. This one was larger and more heavily armored, its jaws snapping dangerously close to Jack's head. Zixer intervened just in time, slamming into the creature with enough force to send it sprawling. The battle raged on, a chaotic dance of light and shadow. Grace continued working furiously to stabilize the barrier, her heart pounding as she listened to the sounds of combat behind her. Finally, with a sharp crackle, the dome resealed itself, trapping the remaining hostile dragons outside. The ones that had breached the barrier were quickly subdued by Zixer and his allies, their movements slowing as they succumbed to exhaustion or injury. When the dust settled, the clearing was eerily quiet. Jack leaned against a nearby crystal structure, breathing heavily as he surveyed the aftermath. His shirt was torn, and a shallow cut ran along his forearm, but otherwise he appeared unharmed. Grace knelt beside Lily, checking her for injuries. The little girl clung to her tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's okay," Grace murmured, smoothing Lily's hair. "You're safe now." Zixer approached cautiously, its posture relaxed once more. It lowered its head toward Jack. And Grace, emitting a soft hum of gratitude, Lily wiped her eyes and stepped forward, placing a hand on the dragon's snout. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved us." Grace exchanged a glance with Jack, both of them realizing how close they had come to disaster. "We owe them to," she said quietly. "Without their help, we wouldn't have stood a chance." Jack nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, let's just hope this doesn't happen again." As the group regrouped, Grace turned her attention back to the ship. "We need to finish repairs as quickly as possible. Those hostile dragons won't give up easily. If they find another way in, we'll deal with that when it happens," Jack interrupted, his voice firm. "For now, let's focus on getting this ship ready to fly." With renewed determination, they returned to work. The peaceful dragons assisted wherever they could, their actions precise and efficient. Even Lily pitched in, fetching tools and holding parts steady when needed. Despite the lingering tension, a sense of camaraderie began to grow among them. Fragile alliance forged in the heat of battle, hours passed, and the ship's systems gradually came back online. Panels lit up with brilliant hues, and the hum of machinery grew louder and steadier. Grace tested the propulsion system, her face lighting up with relief as it powered on without issue. "We did it," she announced, her voice filled with awe. "It's working." Zixer let out a triumphant roar, its scales shimmering brightly in response. The other dragons gathered around, their movements celebratory yet restrained. Lily smiled up at them, her earlier fears replaced by pride. "You can go home now," she said softly, "or at least somewhere safe." Grace knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "And you'll be going home too, sweetheart. Your parents are worried sick about you." Lily nodded, though her expression wavered slightly. "Will I? Will I ever see them again?" Grace hesitated, unsure how to answer. Before she could respond, Zixer nudged Lily gently, projecting a final image into her mind. It was a vision of stars stretching endlessly across the sky, accompanied by a feeling of warmth and connection. Lily smiled, understanding the message. "Goodbye, Zixer," she whispered, hugging the dragon's snout tightly. "Thank you for everything." As the preparations for departure continued, Jack and Grace packed up their equipment, ensuring nothing was left behind that might reveal the truth of what had transpired. When everything was ready, Zixer guided them to the edge of the dome, where the barrier shimmered invitingly. "This is it," Grace said, turning to Jack. "Are you ready?" He nodded, glancing back at the ship one last time. Lily home. With that, they stepped through the barrier, leaving the alien refuge behind. As they emerged into the woods, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, bathing the world in golden light. For the first time in days, they felt a glimmer of hope and the promise of a fresh start. The journey back to the edge of the woods felt surreal. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor. Jack led the way, his steps cautious but steady, while Grace followed closely behind. With Lily tucked protectively under her arm, the little girl clung to Grace, her small hands gripping the fabric of her jacket as if afraid to let go. Though she had been returned safely, the weight of everything she'd experienced lingered in her wide, unblinking eyes as they walked. Jack kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the hostile dragons to burst through the trees at any moment. But the forest remained quiet, save for the occasional chirp of birds and rustle of leaves. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched not by enemies this time, but by Zixer and its companions, who had likely stayed close to ensure their escape went smoothly. Grace noticed his unease and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're almost there," she said softly, "just a little farther." Jack nodded, though his jaw remained clenched. "Yeah, let's just hope we don't run into anyone before we reach the town." They moved quickly, navigating the uneven terrain with practiced ease. Lily stumbled once or twice, her legs still shaky from hours spent sitting on the metallic ground inside the dome. As time, Grace caught her gently, murmuring words of encouragement. "You're doing great, sweetheart. We're almost home." Home. The word hung heavy in the air, carrying both comfort and uncertainty. For Lily, it meant reuniting with her parents and leaving behind the strange world she had briefly touched. For Jack and Grace, it meant facing questions they weren't sure they could answer, questions about where Lily had been, what had happened to her, and why two strangers had brought her back when they finally reached the outskirts of the town. The sight of familiar houses and streets brought a wave of relief and apprehension. People milled about, some tending to gardens, others chatting on porches. A few glanced curiously at the trio as they emerged from the woods, their expressions shifting from surprise to concern when they recognized Lily. "Is that—" one woman began, her voice trailing off as she pointed toward the girl. Word spread quickly, and within moments, a small crowd had gathered around them. Mary Harper pushed her way to the front, her face pale with worry, until she saw her daughter. "Lily!" she cried, rushing forward and pulling the child into a tight embrace. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she held Lily close, rocking her back and forth. "Oh, my baby, my sweet girl." Robert Harper joined them, his eyes red-rimmed and his hands trembling as he stroked Lily's hair. "Where did you find her?" he asked, looking between Jack and Grace. Grace stepped forward, her tone calm but firm. "She wandered deeper into the woods than we realized. We tracked her down and made sure she was safe." "And those lights in the sky?" someone else asked, suspicion creeping into their voice. "What were they?" Jack exchanged a glance with Grace before answering. "Probably just a meteor shower. It happens sometimes." It's caught everyone's attention, though. Explanation seemed to satisfy most of the townsfolk, but a few lingered, their eyes narrowed as they studied the strangers. Jack shifted uncomfortably. Under their scrutiny, his hand instinctively brushing against the pocket knife at his belt. He didn't like crowds or questions he couldn't fully answer. Mary hugged Lily even tighter, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I thought I'd lost you forever." "I'm okay, Mommy," Lily replied, her voice small but steady. She glanced up at Jack and Grace, her expression filled with gratitude. "These nice people helped me." Robert turned to them, extending a hand. "Thank you. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you." Jack shook his hand briefly, his grip firm but brief. "Just glad we could help." Grace smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Take good care of her." With that, the pair stepped back, allowing the Harpers to focus on their reunion. As the family retreated toward their home, surrounded by neighbors offering hugs and condolences, Jack and Grace slipped away unnoticed. They walked in silence for a while, the weight of what they had witnessed and concealed heavy on their shoulders. Eventually, Grace broke the quiet. "Do you think they'll be okay?" Jack shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "They will if no one asks too many questions. But something tells me this isn't over." "What do you mean?" "The hostile dragons," Jack replied grimly. "They wanted that ship, and they won't stop looking for it. If they figure out how to track Zixer and the others," Grace frowned, her mind racing, "then we need to make sure they can't. Maybe we should destroy the crash site, erase any evidence that might lead them here." "It's risky," Jack admitted, "but it might be the only way to keep everyone safe." They reached the van. Parked on the edge of town, its dented frame standing out starkly against the neat rows of suburban houses. Jack climbed into the driver's seat while Grace settled into the passenger side, her thoughts swirling. As they drove away, neither of them spoke, lost in their own reflections. Hours later, they arrived at the crash site. The crystalline structures that had formed the dome were eerily silent now, their glow faded and their surfaces dull. Jack grabbed a toolbox from the back of the van, while Grace carried a container of chemicals designed to neutralize energy signatures. Working together, they dismantled the remnants of the barrier, carefully disabling its core components. "This should do it," Grace said, stepping back as the last shard of crystal crumbled to dust. The clearing looked almost ordinary now, save for a few patches of scorched earth and scattered debris. Anyone stumbling upon it would assume it was nothing more than the aftermath of a lightning strike. Jack nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Let's get out of here." As they packed up their gear, A low hum filled the air, a sound so faint it was almost imperceptible. Grace froze, her head snapping toward the source. "Do you hear that?" Jack listened intently, his hand instinctively reaching for his knife. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Then, without warning, the air shimmered, and a figure materialized before them. It was YX, or the dragon's scales gleamed faintly in the fading sunlight, its multiple sets of eyes glowing with an intensity that made it hard to look directly at it. It tilted its head, studying them with an expression that seemed almost grateful. "You came back," Grace whispered, lowering her guard slightly. "Why?" Zixer responded with a series of melodic tones, accompanied by a flood of mental images. Jack staggered slightly, clutching his temples as the visions washed over him. Grace steadied herself against the van, her breath catching as she processed the message. "They're saying thank you," she explained, her voice choked with emotion. "And they're warning us. The hostile dragons are still out there, and they'll stop at nothing to find them." Jack straightened, his expression grim. "Then we'd better be ready." Zixer let out a final hum, its body dissolving into a cascade of shimmering particles that faded into the twilight. When the last trace of the dragon disappeared, the clearing fell silent once more. Grace exhaled sharply, leaning against the van. "Do you think we'll see them again?" Jack shook, his head climbing into the driver's seat. "Maybe. But either way, we've got work to do." As they drove away, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shadow. Behind them, the woods stood dark and quiet, hiding secrets that only a few would ever understand. And somewhere, beyond the stars, Zixer and its companions soared toward an uncertain future, carrying with them the memory of a brave little girl who had bridged to world's end, changed their destinies forever.